Hey, I'm Craig Newmark. American democracy is under threat, and we all need to work together to protect the country and to protect our democracy. It's kind of like in World War II, when everyone was expected to play a role. And the first part of this is for all of us to learn a little more and to work together, strengthening American democracy, strengthening the country. The Civic Life series is a big part of that, and the 92nd Street Y, New York, is the right forum for delivering all that. I appreciate your joining me. Thanks.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Jennifer Weiss-Wolf. I am Executive Director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Center at NYU School of Law, and I'm Executive Director for Partnerships and Strategy at Ms. Magazine. Both organizations are co-hosts of this evening's programming on backsliding democracy and women's rights. Thank you all so much for being here. I know this will be an illuminating conversation for the 92nd Street Y community. The title of this event, as I referred to, is Democratic Backsliding, which invokes a continuum for our conversation tonight. And I think that it is important to think about the long-term picture, what it looks like to slide from democracy to authoritarianism. Many organizations that rate and use indicators or quantitative data to determine the state of democracy show that we are in a global decline. According to the United Nations, though, this trajectory is rarely analyzed or looked at through the lens of gender equity. That is absolutely not true of the group that was here to talk to you tonight. And I am so excited for this conversation. We know that the role of gender in rising authoritarianism is a really important piece of the equation. It's something we need to name, I think, to be able to change, all of which is to say the conversation tonight is extremely important. Thrilled to introduce our extraordinary panelists, real experts in this field who will delve into all of this and more. I will start with our moderator for this evening's discussion, Laleh Ispahani, who is Executive Director of Open Society's U.S. programs. She is joined by Suyen Barahona, who is Director of the Women's Political Leadership Fund, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is Professor of History and Italian Studies at NYU and author of the book Strong Man, Christine Ryan, who is the Director of the Religious Liberty and Reproductive Rights Project at Columbia Law School's Center for Gender and Sexuality and the Law, and Regina, Tamés, who is Deputy Director of the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch in Mexico City. So I will turn it over to you, Laleh. Thank you so much, everybody, for this evening's conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jen, and thank you all for being here. I've been really looking forward to the conversation, most of all because it brings together this pretty unique and amazing group, people who reflect an array of disciplines, possess a set of unique skills, and reach really a pretty broad variety of influential constituencies, all with extraordinary, bold brilliance and ideas. So I thought we would first start with a question for the group, for each of you, and that is to explain the following. How do you explain the interplay between gender and democracy in the work that you do and with the constituencies you each serve? And if I could, for this question, I'd love to start with you, Suyen, and then go to Regina and then Christine and close with Ruth.
Thank you so much, first of all, for this space and this conversation. I'm really honored to be in the company of such amazing women. And in terms of the question, well, the Women's Political Leadership Fund really wants to advance women's feminist and democratic political leadership, and we're trying to focus on the global South. That's where we would want to support also women who have been marginalized, including racialized women, indigenous peoples, LGBTQI, people with disabilities. And we really do believe that democracy and a democratic future is really possible in the measure that the power and the diversity of women are recognized. And only if we are able also to harness the equal and inclusive representation of women. So there's absolutely an interdependent relationship for us between gender and democracy. Greater democracy leads to better gender equality and vice versa. And what we've been seeing is that when there is a strong representation of women political leaders, then countries are overall better, and the progress improves. There's more economic equality. That's what the data is also telling us, and that women political leaders are making vital decisions that are improving the well-being of millions of people. And so also research is showing that increased representation of women in elected office has a role in counteracting corruption. Women are championing policy proposals that are really also benefiting those who are most vulnerable. Confidence in democracy is related to women's political involvement, the possibility of cooperation across party lines, and they are playing a huge and crucial role also in peace and security efforts. And in the measure that more women are involved, then that also translates into securing long-term peace and stability among nations. So we feel like there are really contexts in which women are really a pro-democratic force, in many places of the world, and they're essential in rolling back authoritarianism, and they're essential in strengthening democracy. And unfortunately, they continue to be underrepresented. That's what the data is telling us too, that it will take 130 years at this rate to reach equality at the highest positions of power. So we can't talk about a full democracy when we are excluding 50% of the population.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Suyen. Let me go to Regina.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, for inviting me. And I feel so honored to be sharing this space with all of you. I think in the same lines as my colleague, I would say that at Human Rights Watch, one of the most challenging part of our job, which I think it's similar to what we just heard, is articulating a clear message on how fighting for a healthy democracy and fighting for women's rights go hand in hand. The problem of siloing the issue, both from public and political discussions, and then putting democracy aside, I think it's one of the main challenges still. And to the extent in which this is understood, this is definitely what will make our case stronger. I don't think we have been fully successful in this regard, but significantly advances have been made. And I believe this is also a clear achievement to feminist movements. And these achievements are something we definitely, I think, need to prioritize, to cherish, and to continue to nurture. It's clear that two of the main objectives of democracy are the pursuit of equality, the pursuit of inclusion, and therefore fully recognizing women's rights is inherently democratic, but at the same time or simultaneously it contributes to strengthening democracy. It might seem obvious to us, but it was not the case during the first decades of democracy building, and I think it's still today many political actors, even those with democratic convictions, still today does not recognize this fully, or what does this would look in reality. And having said that, then I think that it is important to recognize that it is not just on authoritarian governments that women's rights are violated and there's a lack of gender perspective, but also women face restrictions within democracies too. But it is true that in democracies and with democratic institutions, I think that there's more tools for women to fight back. So countries with a stronger rule of law, functioning checks and balances, women are better able to protect their rights, and so is everyone else. So it's usually interesting to use or to say how to evaluate in some sense how a democratic country is doing by analyzing the progress and setbacks on women's rights. And I think, for example, freedom of expression is something that we sometimes take for granted. And even in democratic countries, there are reprisals against freedom of expression, and women have used freedom of expression as such a powerful tool to respect the rights. And I think that's only possible in democracies where there's truly this understanding that I've been trying to talk about. I would just finally say that I think and this is minor in a way, in our job, we use international human rights law as a very strong tool to protect and expand women's rights. I don't think this is the only tool, the perfect tool at all, but it definitely complements as a tool to be used, playing a crucial role in pursuing countries to recognize and address diverse inequalities that we still see. So that's something that Human Rights Watch uses constantly. And some of the demands from women's rights organizations or feminist organizations could transform using these tools from demands to actual obligations that you can see in laws and policies. I will leave it there.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate you raising up how women strengthen democracy, but democratic tools also help advance women's empowerment. It's such a terrific point. Can I go to you next, Christine?
Great, absolutely. Just to echo everybody else who has mentioned, what an honor it is to be in this space with fantastic scholars and advocates who I admire and am very grateful. So I work, as Jen mentioned at the outset, at the Law, Rights, Religion Project at Columbia Law School. And primarily what we do is both study and advise on legal strategies using religious liberty law to advance reproductive freedom and other social justice issues. But my area of focus is reproductive rights. And I used to work primarily at the international level, but I came to see that the anti-gender and anti-rights movements that I was studying globally were very active here in the country where I live, and it seemed urgent to apply my attention to the domestic context. So in terms of gender and democracy in my work, you might be aware that in the post-Dobbs era, that is the overturning of the constitutional protection for abortion rights, there are lawsuits in many states across the country challenging abortion bans as violations of free exercise rights or as unconstitutional establishments of religion. And this strategy is animated by questions of gender and democracy, and it plays out in different ways. You know, one level, the plaintiffs in these cases are members of religious minorities. They're Jews, Muslims, they're spiritualists who are trying to reclaim space in their democracy, which to them has been distorted by Christian nationalists. And in simple terms, they feel as though the dictates of a religion that is not their own is being imposed on them. And other plaintiffs are what I call dissenters within their own faith traditions. So I have in mind here, you know, groups Catholics for Choice, Baptists for Choice, who are rejecting the orthodoxy of their religious leaders in favor of their own understanding of their faith and bringing that to the public sphere. And this is important from the perspective of seeking a democracy that serves gender equality, because in the most obvious sense, as a strategy to expand abortion access that's critical to gender equality, but also these plaintiffs and the movement they're part of is reclaiming one of the primary legal tools, freedom of religion rights, that has been used with stunning success by right-wing actors to undermine contemporary advances in gender equality. And of course, in addition to these individuals trying to exercise their own religious belief without undue state interference, we can also see these suits as part of a movement to protect against church-state separation. And what they're doing is fighting against an exercise of religious dominion over over them, because these abortion bans are serving goals of the powerful to propagate an identity of this nation as Christian and consolidate and concentrate political power among those who are willing to govern in accordance with nationalist ideals. And that very much is something I recognize from other contexts in which I have worked, and I think we'll get into as the conversation goes on.
Thank you so much, Christine. It's interesting that the faith dimension is not one that is in the front of the news or people's minds necessarily, but also so important to this debate and to many other very important rights debates of recent years. Let's close this round with you, Ruth. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for creating this space for us and bringing us together. I'm really thrilled to be here. When I wrote my book Strongmen, it was the first book that looked at the autocratic tools of rule that included on purpose a chapter about masculinity and how it interacted with propaganda, violence, corruption to destroy democracies and prop up autocracies. And yet that's the part of the book which I felt most strongly about, but it was the part of the book that was the least taken up by the press and by people didn't want to engage with the sexual violence themes. So that's kind of symptomatic, I feel. And as a historian writing about the present, I've always felt that my job is to show patterns that continue today and give people an awareness of what to look for and how to interpret events that are unfolding, in their own lives. And certainly a through line in the dissolution of democracies and consolidation of autocracies. These things happen when there are great anxieties about social change and gender relations, anxieties about changes in gender relations, which are seen as changes in power relations, are integral to these transitional moments. So my research shows that when men feel that their economic or social status is declining and they perceive that women's status is increasing, this is when they are susceptible to kind of charismatic demagogues who we have Giorgia Meloni, maybe we'll talk about her later, but they've been men and who make very explicit the job that they want to do of rolling back women's rights to protect men. This becomes explicit part of the platform, as well as the removal of restrictions on men. And I'll come back to that maybe in the next question. Mussolini, who started all this for the right-wing variant, he defined fascism as a revolution of reaction. And really this reaction, this process is clearest in the area of gender. So from World War I, where you had millions of men disabled and disenfranchised and lots of women emancipated, and fascism comes in as a correction of this, taking away, reproductive rights and to Spain before the 1936 coup, where women in Spain got property rights, inheritance rights. For the first time, Russia in the 1990s, where there was, which we don't talk about enough anymore, a total epidemic of male suicide, male alcoholism, and in comes Putin, the strong man, to change all that, up to the reaction against, Barack Obama's presidency. Not only is the first African-American president, but you had the admission of women to combat. You had the legalization of same-sex marriage. So up comes Trump, who's going to kind of turn the clock back. And so whenever we hear talk about a crisis of masculinity from the far right, this is a sign that people are gunning for democracy as well. And so we're seeing this with people ranging from Tucker Carlson in our country to Senator Josh Hawley, lamenting the crisis of masculinity, writing about the need for strong masculinity, and advocating for kind of authoritarian politics.
So Ruth, actually, let's stay with you, and sort of we'll use the reverse order I have a more targeted question for each of you now, and so let's actually, as I said, pick up pick back up with you, Ruth. You are a leading historian, scholar, media commentator, or rather media communicator, and expert on the evolution and use of the authoritarian playbook, something my own organization has some experience in Hungary and elsewhere. And you mentioned your recent book, Strong Men. So let me ask you two questions, listening to you sort of make the general, articulate the general relationship as you see it between gender and women's rights, gender and power and so on. And then so let me just go to these two questions. What authoritarian trends globally do you think we should be most preoccupied, most concerned with as we face a more than a non-zero possibility of a potential President Trump once again in the US? So what global trends might be most influential? And then if time allows, let's also just think about, I'd love your thoughts on women leaders like Giorgia Meloni, who you just referenced, in Italy, who sort of draw from the authoritarian playbook to inform their leadership, at least in some part. And in that kind of, in a country led by a woman, what do you have a sense of things to be concerned about when women's rights seem to regress either visibly or less visibly?
Yeah, those are great questions. So there's a double dynamic to authoritarianism. Some people, including women, lose their rights, and other people have new liberties to do things, such as men who authoritarian is about the removal of rights for some and the expansion of liberties to plunder, including women's bodies, for others. So that's the dynamic I'm going to talk about. So authoritarian gender policy is a kind of toxic triad of misogyny, homophobia, and hypermasculinity. And this translates into regimes of law, right? Taking away LGBTQ rights, taking away women's rights, reproductive rights, and privileging in the discourse and often the law, protecting men. And it is, as terms of what I'm very concerned about, it's combining with racism. It's always been melded together in theories such as great replacement theory, population demographic concerns about white extinction, population decline, that since the fascist years with pronatalism policy, and Mussolini in the 1920s started talking about, as he called them, Black, brown, and yellow people who were procreating too much, and they were at the borders. I mean, there's nothing new about, what Orban and GOP are saying. You can actually, it's very closely matched, their rhetoric. And so the outcome are new rounds of persecution we're seeing against actually the usual targets of authoritarians. And it's really disheartening that you go through 100 years of history like I do in my book, and it's the same groups. People of color, women, LGBTQ people, nomadic peoples, ethnic and religious minorities. They over and over again are the targets. And I'll treat Meloni separately, but she's an example. So great replacement theory, which again, it has an effect on women because women are being valued only so insofar as they are mothers and they can contribute to the population. And so that's also in our country, the whole movement to have homeschooling. There's a lot of different ramifications and outcomes of this. But Meloni's version of great replacement theory, which holds that immigrants and non-white immigrants they're coming in and they're having so many babies that they're going to overwhelm white births, and so slowly there's this fear of a propagandist, you want to implant an existential fear of annihilation in a group, and this leads them to be more susceptible to accepting violence against those who are trying to extinguish whites. And so, this is very widespread around the world. There's actually been the standardization of far-right talking points on this between among Hungary and Moscow and Rome and the GOP and all these kind of circuits. But her version of great replacement theory is terrifying because she calls it ethnic substitution, which evokes ethnic cleansing, as though whites are, again, they're being annihilated. And she also, up through 2019, had it was one of the people who was conjuring the most conspiracy theories, because some people use great replacement theory to say there's natural changes in demographic changes that are leading to this, lessening of white people. She sees a plot by George Soros and by the EU to flood Italy and other countries, white countries, with immigrants so that they will overpopulate and take all the jobs. So she sees an intent there, a plot there. So she's masquerading as conservative, like many of these people, Katalin Novak, who just resigned. They all have the same talking points, but they're extremely, they're very extreme ideas. So that's one side. The other side of authoritarianism, though, that I'm really concerned about, that affects women equally, is so some people lose their rights. Other people, such as men, they have their restrictions on their behavior rolled back so that they are able to take liberties and plunder. Authoritarianism is about license to plunder. Bodies, women's bodies. So sexual violence is not, it's decriminalized often. Plundering the labor force, plundering the environment, and plundering the economy for personal gain. And then we get to kleptocracies, such as Putin's. And so authoritarianism is about getting away with crime, but all of these things are interlinked. And so when you have plunderers in power, women's bodies are one of the things that get plundered. And so Trump is a good example. He, during his time in the White House, he rolled back over 100 environmental and food safety restrictions. But he also, and this is related, partly decriminalized domestic violence in America. And there was so much going on that kind of flew under the radar that he did that. So that before it was a more expansive definition of domestic violence, including economic deprivation, psychological harassment. That now it's all removed. It had to be only physical, and we know that women can be preyed upon and abused in many ways. So he did that, as well as serving as a kind of poster boy for lawless behavior toward women, and also appointing many domestic abusers to high office. So you create a culture of impunity for sexual violence. You reward lawlessness and a certain brand of masculinity that's defined by getting your way, whether it's in politics or the bedroom, without asking consent. So this is the dynamic, and I'm concerned about both of these aspects going forward as they are unfolding globally. Do you want me to talk about Meloni, or we're out of time? Oh, I think you're muted.
I'd love to hear a little bit more, and I imagine the audience would too. Please do, Ruth.
Okay. So in the conclusion of the first edition of my book, which is written in 2020, I wrote at the end that I felt that a female-led authoritarian state was inevitable, and that while such a leader would not be stripping her shirt off, because I talked about Mussolini and Putin, their virility claims, that they would be equally corrupt, equally racist, and equally misogynistic in their own fashion. At the time, I was thinking of Marine Le Pen of France, but of course it's been Giorgia Meloni, who's mentored spiritually by Mussolini and practically by Silvio Berlusconi, two serial sex abusers. And she and Le Pen and the just resigned president of Hungary, Katalin Novak, are examples of what political scientists have called gender washing. And these are female leaders who cultivate a soft image. So, and they are about we're mothers first, and anything else comes secondary. And so Meloni often dresses in flowing pastels. Le Pen has, like, you know, classic understated French wardrobe. And this is a cover for the very blunt force of their racism and their extremism. And so they masquerade as being representing an advance for women, but their actual policies are engaging in this correction that I talked about earlier, by making motherhood the most important job of women, linking often social welfare assistance and status in society to how you are contributing to the white Christian population. So this is the gender washing. And so Meloni has opposed, quote, what she calls gender ideology, LGBT lobbies. These are quotes from her. And the big talking point is the, quote, natural family, which is, of course, the man and the woman and no other articulation of the family. So what happens with politicians, especially autocrats, is that they are inspired by one another. And so the more success that these gender washing females have, the more imitators will come up on the scene. So that's the trend to look for. That is quite unfortunate, because it goes with the it goes with, you know, attacks on democracy and our rights.
I'm really glad you did answer that part of the question, because it strikes me that that's one big difference between the sort of disempowering of women in older authoritarian regimes versus today's more authoritarian and authoritarian-friendly regimes, which is this strong, apparently strong female leaders in government and in prominent roles increasingly. The other point that really strikes me is, so echoes across the work we've done globally, is the link of race and gender. If you look across a score of metrics, whether it's political power of women, Suyen, to maternal health statistics in the world, it's always women of color, especially Black women in the U.S., for example, that bear the brunt and are lowest on all those metrics. So really appreciate all of that, Ruth. So turning to you, Christine. So we know that authoritarian governments target gender relatively overtly much of the time, but women's rights, LGBTQ rights, are also under attack in democracies today. At an NYU event last year, you said, while what ostensibly might look like a functioning democracy often has elements that are autocratic. For example, for women. In Ireland, where you were from, you mentioned that this was a serious case study for that proposition. Could you say a little bit more on the Irish case? What lessons can we draw from that example for the broader strategy? As you know, in the U.S., we're contending with fallout of the significant, substantial loss of federal protections for abortion. So now every state is having to figure out a way forward in a very large country. And at least one Supreme Court justice has suggested that the court even reconsider protections for gay marriage and even contraception. So over to you.
Thank you. Stark times, in as you mentioned. So Ruth mentioned the prioritization of motherhood in policy. And in Ireland, the prioritization of motherhood actually made its way into the Constitution. Ireland's Constitution protected fetal personhood until 2018. This was inserted in the 1980s, 1983, by referendum, so public vote. The Eighth Amendment, as it was known, equated the right to life of the mother and the unborn child. And in practical terms, this amendment governed Irish law and policy on abortion and translated into an almost total legal ban on abortion except where abortion was necessary to avert a substantial risk to a pregnant woman's life. So you see remnants of that, echoes of that here in different states around the country. But going back to Ireland, what this meant in practice was that people who had abortions outside of the permitted exception and anyone who assisted them faced up to 14 years in prison. And what that meant was that women traveled abroad. Approximately 4,000 to 5,000 at different times went abroad for abortions every year, and an unknown number of women maintained unwanted pregnancies. But in a good news story, in May 2018, the people of Ireland voted by a majority in all jurisdictions minus one to repeal that amendment from the Constitution and legalise abortion in the country within the public healthcare system. So interestingly, if we consider, and what I mentioned at the NYU talk, was that Ireland, from the outside, very much was a democracy at this time. Even though it was in its infancy as such, it could be accurate to describe the Irish state and Irish society as quite Catholic in many respects. We need to complicate the picture and unsettle the idea that the abortion ban could be explained just because the majority of the people were Catholic and remain Catholic. 2 years ago, in 1922, Ireland celebrated its centenary, so 100 years of statehood. And while it didn't become a full republic until 1937, Irish statehood was the result of a long struggle against colonialism for independence and democracy. And the 1922 Free State Constitution, the first constitution that the state had, actually guaranteed equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens without distinction of sex. But within a decade of the state's foundings, Ireland's national policies included a ban on divorce, the criminalisation of the importation of contraceptives, and even limits on the ability of married women to participate in the workforce. So until Ireland joined the EU, women upon marriage, if they worked in the public sector, had to resign. So how to explain, this slide from proclaiming gender equality in the state's founding documents to an onslaught of measures restricting women's access to the public sphere? And this is also surprising, particularly because this is not long after women played a significant role in both the political and armed struggle to create the state. Again, some just might say that Irish people were Catholic, but the root of the problem isn't in the religiosity of the populace. Rather, it was the power grab by a small number of religious actors. That might sound familiar to many people. So in the new state in Ireland, there was a power vacuum. And that's common in emerging and fragile states. And what often happens is these power voids are filled by non-state actors. It can be armed groups in some contexts, or religious orders. And in Ireland, it was a Catholic hierarchy who secured a grip on the government, both of whom then worked together to set about establishing Ireland's identity as a pious and patriarchal state, and that lasted for most of the 20th century. It took a very long time to cast off those shackles. Even when the Catholic Church lost its grip on political life in Ireland, as I mentioned, Ireland joined the European Union in 1973. It had the fastest growing economy in the world in the early 90s. Ireland provided free third level education, had an established public healthcare system. And despite these freedoms in many important senses, women's reproductive rights, and as such their freedom, remained starkly curtailed. For people to make their own decisions about pregnancy and family, they had to leave, ironically, to the former colonizer, England. And it was that country that offered recognition for the humanity of Irish women. And this leads to the second point I want to make about the inconsistencies between not just the ideals and the structures of democracy that can be in place and gender equality, is that Ireland had a functioning democracy in the political science understanding of the term. And unlike other contexts, the structures of that democracy were actually quite healthy. There wasn't a gerrymandering problem. Judges were independent. There were campaign finance laws. There was a free press. There was no Fox News. Yet it took 95 years for the Irish state to recognise women's status as equal citizens by recognising their ability to make decisions about their own lives and reproduction. And why? Well, the first answer isn't a good one. And the first lesson from the Irish case isn't a good one. Because if the Irish example tells us anything, it's that once a faction embeds itself within the government, such that the legislator can be relied upon to enforce religious dogmas as civil and criminal law, it can take a very long time to undo this pattern. And people suffer in the meantime and suffer miserably. But in Ireland, even when public attitudes towards abortion suggested favourable conditions for reform, politicians and government leadership balked at the idea, as for generations they had been bred to believe that abortion was untouchable. And it took a very powerful movement to undo that mentality. So the good lesson is that that powerful movement, the Irish abortion rights movement, did succeed, and that the conservative project in Ireland ultimately failed. It became intolerable and the people rejected it, and a feminist forward-looking movement recreated and re-established women's status as equal citizens. And so in thinking about the US, I'm going to quote a Irish writer who's a great commentator on the US, Fintan O'Toole, who after Dobbs wrote that banning abortion is a line in the sand only in the sense that, like all such lines, it gets washed away by the tides of life.
Suyen, will you bring us sort of full circle on this? You served as president of the Nicaraguan Unión Democrática Renovadora, and you were jailed with hundreds of women for 600 plus days for political and human rights activism. What would you say about why authoritarians are so threatened by feminist leadership? And how did that experience shape the work you're leading now at the Women's Political Leadership Fund and the ways you aim now to support women and feminist political leaders around the world? Please say a bit about that. Do you see this as part of the antidote to sort of the authoritarian upsurge in the last decade or so? And how can others help ensure that women, particularly those advocating like you have for social and political change, are protected from violence and backlash?
Yeah, I think they're threatened because feminist leaders have also been countering authoritarian advances around the world. And when there have been assaults on democracy globally, you've seen also women feminist leaders and those who have also been historically marginalized worldwide at the forefront, advocating for democracy, for freedom, for equity, and also responding to the ongoing attacks on human rights, despite the risks, despite the threats. And I think they're threatened because we are talking also about shifting existing power dynamics, and that, of course, means that there's an understanding, that power is at the heart of all of these injustices and the discrimination, the inequalities, the exclusion, the violence, and that threatens, of course, their authoritarian regimes. And I, for example, I personally had, like 15 years of basically denouncing every assault to democracy, and was had 15 years of struggling against the consolidation of a dictatorship in the country, in my country, which is Nicaragua, and as democracy was being dismantled, it was really the feminists and the broader women's movements who were the first to warn about what was happening and and to alert the population about what was happening. It was the feminists who were who were the first to accompany the stepdaughter of Daniel Ortega, the current dictator, to denounce that he had abused her since she was 11 years old. And so it was the feminist movement that accompanied Soy la América in this. And then after that, everywhere he went, there were women feminists around the world that would make it uncomfortable for him to arrive, because it was feminists who were at the forefront denouncing what was happening in the country, and it was feminists and women who were who took the streets also in 2018, and who were at some point denouncing the banning of therapeutic abortion in the country, in Nicaragua. It was women also who were at the forefront in Nicaragua demanding justice for the 350 murders that had happened during the uprisings in 2018, and who continue to claim for justice for their family members when they began to shoot with snipers down on peaceful demonstrations. So I think it's this belligerence that is threatening authoritarians around the world. While I was in jail, there were 4 of us who were from my political party, and we were all identified as feminists. And you could see that there was a particular viciousness. We were kept in solitary confinement for 606 days, and there was an environment of torture that was included, isolation, the absolute prohibition of socializing with anyone else, deprivation of sunlight. We were not allowed to read and write. There were food restrictions, interrogations that were hundreds of them, and they didn't allow us to see our families. And something very particular also, that we were banned from seeing our minors. In my case, I was banned from seeing my son, who was at that time 4 years old, and not allowed to communicate with anyone. And this cruel treatment really it was exercised because I was a feminist, and there was the intention of punishing us. And because they wanted to silence us and to break us, and also because they wanted to demonstrate that it was not our place to be involved in politics. And that's what they would also say in the hundreds of interrogations. So, and that viciousness, and you see, how threatened they feel too, was accompanied not only of when we were released which was last year on February 9th, the 222 political prisoners that I was part of, we were also banished to the United States. We were banished from our country, and that same day our nationality was stripped. So we became stateless, and which are crimes against humanity. They've erased us from this Nicaraguan civil registry. Family members are being impeded to enter the country, so they're also becoming stateless. So I'm sharing these experiences because this is unfortunately this is a reality for so many of the women who get involved also in the struggle for democracy throughout the world, and who are facing authoritarian regimes as the one that we are facing in Nicaragua. You see the threats or how threatened they feel also in what has happened in terms of removing the legal status and wanting to disappear organizations that defend women's rights in the country. In Nicaragua, over 3,600 organizations have been closed, shut down, and among them 176 organizations were women's organizations that were defending the rights of women. So the last time that in the country we were able to celebrate an 8th of March, the 8th of March Day was in 2018. We were not, allowed to do that, and nobody is allowed in the country. So I think, like I said, there's a particular viciousness against feminists because we have been at the forefront in that struggle for democracy, for justice, for gender equality. And yeah, of course, it's really this experience, the personal experience, but really the experience of so many other women involved in politics around the world who are experiencing heightened risk and violence is shaping the work that we want to do in the Women's Political Leadership Fund. In my case, I feel like these very difficult personal experience has, instead of silencing me or breaking me, has strengthened my convictions and really deepened my commitment to further democracy and justice around the world, not only in my country, but also really wanting to support, to create support structures, for women, so that they can gain political power and that we can open up new opportunities in political spaces and to further gender equality. And I'm absolutely committed to it, and it has shaped, these experiences do shape the fund, because I also feel like the experience, my own experience, but that of many others, is really permeated too by the support of networks of other courageous women, that help you navigate and overcome the barriers. And so, which are many, and we've talked, colleagues here have talked about many of those barriers, but the violence, the biases, the cultural, the institutional barriers. And so in the Women's Political Leadership Fund, we are analyzing those barriers and definitely wanting to support women and reduce those barriers for women's political participation. We hope that we can increase that, contribute to increase that pipeline of women political leaders that are standing in elections and that hold democratic values. And to be able to build technical, political, and also economic platforms to support women political leaders, especially those who are coming from communities that are the most marginalized. And we really have seen the need, for more critical funding to advance women's leadership. Those who are struggling for human rights, for democracy, and who have, a feminist perspective, who want to move forward agendas that are favorable for women and for society as a whole, And definitely one of the common barriers throughout continents is that of violence, of harassment, and including now more and more the online violence that they're experiencing and abuse, the threats, and also physical attacks. So it's a very hostile environment, and that is creating barriers for their participation. And we've seen this, how toxic the environment can be, and that's why we are seeing also other women stepping down from positions. You've seen it with, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, how she felt burned out and exhausted and had to step out. We've seen the threats of and the murders, of a Brazilian politician, Marielle Franco, of British Parliament member Joe Cox, a former Afghan member of Parliament, Mursal Nabizada, sorry. So it's such a hostile and violent environment that 1 out of 6 women who hold positions don't finish their term. That's what the statistics are saying, and so the recognizing this environment and knowing firsthand, in my case of these experiences, we really do feel like there is a need to prioritize and support more initiatives for holistic protection and safety of women political leaders, and to look at also the whole dimension of well-being, of mental well-being, and to help women develop resiliency strategies and to help them sustain their leadership and respond to the threats that they are facing. It's not only about how to increase the pipeline of women who are entering these political spaces, but also how can we help them once they're there, how we are able to help them sustain themselves and in those spaces. It is
Thank you, Suyen. Really important point you made about helping people come in. There's a pipeline nurturing. You help people when they're in office, because you can't just get them to office. It's very important to sustain women when they're in office and continue to do that. There's online and offline targeting, as you said, so really appreciate it, starting from your personal experience. So we're going to just do a lightning round. We're close on time. In fact, we're really at that time, 1 minute each. We've talked about a bunch of challenges, but there's always something that keeps us all in the game. So what gives you hope? What excites you? And since our audience is the 92nd Street Y viewers, what can these people, this audience, do in their own lives and through their own activism to highlight what it sounds to me that we've made the case for, which is an inextricable link between democracy and gender justice? Let me start with you, Ruth. Thank you.
Sure. We hear about, obviously we work on threats to democracy, rise of authoritarianism, but we're actually living through a momentous period, a kind of renaissance of mass nonviolent protest around the world. And this gives me great hope, as well as in our country, the resurgence of labor activism. There's many, many signs that people want just and equitable and inclusive leadership, responsible leadership. And there are myriad countries that not only have had sometimes the largest protests they've ever had, or the largest protest they've had in, like in 30, 40 years. So this is a global phenomenon. And so this gives me enormous hope. And the United States is part of that. We don't talk anymore about the Women's March, but it was the largest nonviolent protest in US history, only to be surpassed in 2020 by the Black Lives Matter events, which attracted a multiracial, multi-generational 20 million people. So that energy is there to mobilize for democracy. And what people can do is get involved, canvassing, become a poll worker, get people to register to vote. Any kind of mobilization is useful because the hunger for this is there.
_ Regina, let me turn to you.
Thank you. I would like to highlight my inspiration, which is the Green Wave movement in Latin America. I think while many countries, including the US, are moving away from guaranteeing some rights, including abortion rights, Latin America, it's big and diverse and different countries, but there's been advances that are very inspiring. We've seen advances in Argentina, in Colombia, some states in Mexico. We have in Mexico the same challenges that you do in the United States, where now you have to fight state by state. But and while we have other countries such as Nicaragua and Dominican Republic, which is still, abortion is still completely prohibited, I think what's amazing is what feminist movements have been able to do collectively and really come together in solidarity and invite people that have not been engaged in activism or politics to get engaged in these conversations, which I think is a huge thing that they've done. And I think it's basically feminist movements that in its plurality, their diversity, that keep fighting these authoritarian governments, or even those that call themselves democratic governments that you've all mentioned. I think it's joining those, learning from their experience. I think we have so many amazing activists that inspire us every day, and to make sure they're fine, that they are nurtured, that they are taking care of themselves. And I just can't finalize without expressing also my admiration to Suyen. I think women like you are what inspire us in Latin America, and I think that we need to continue to make sure that these women's voices are heard and keep inspiring others.
Thank you. Christine?
Thanks so much again for to all the speakers, and I've learned so much, and like Regina, just really appreciate being able to be in a space with somebody like Suyen, who has fought, not just studied or supported, but full-on fought dictatorship. Similarly, it's women's resistance, that's the common theme here that inspires us. Again, in the abortion context, what I've always reminded of is, even when you impose severe limits on women's ability to access abortion, most women will creatively and will fight those dictates on them and will access abortion. They will struggle in doing so, and their lives will still be devalued as they do so. But it is a reminder of the need to look for those actions that are filled with agency and resistance. And that is what gives me hope.
Thank you. And Suyen, you have inspired clearly all of us. So let's give you the final word. What gives you hope and inspires you?
Yeah,
today?
well, I'm always I'm excited. I'm excited because I see that that there is a real momentum and alignment and understanding also among different stakeholders, and particularly women who have been historically marginalized, that there is a need to organize, to mobilize, and to generate strategies to demand their representation and their seat at key decision-making power positions. And this is at the local level, at the national level, and at the regional level. And I feel like there's also clarity among the feminist movement that we need those very belligerent, independent feminist movement, but also more women involved in pushing forward agendas that are favorable to women in these political spaces. And I really want to encourage also the viewers, to think about this year, which is a year of of mega elections. Almost half of the world we're having elections almost in half of the countries of the world. Half of the population is going to in some way or another engage in electoral processes. Some are fake electoral processes, but others, there are real opportunities for change. So I would like to encourage you, women in particular, to engage, to go out and to exercise your democratic rights. And that includes going out to vote and making a difference. And that excites me too. There are women who are going out there and making huge difference and really pushing back these authoritarian also leaders who want to take over their countries. And that's very inspiring for me.
Thank you so much. It's so true that 4 billion people will go to the polls, and more than 50 countries this year. So let's make the year of democracy also the year for women and for gender rights. Thank you so much, everyone.